This week's blog post is a walking tour of sculptures in Manhattan's financial district. It's the first part of 10, the introduction and the Surrogates Court. This series is based on a walking tour that I offered some years ago. On this tour we will see the building with more sculptures than any other in New York City, portraits of two media moguls, one of the best sculptures of George Washington anywhere in the United States, a representation of the spirit of 19th century capitalism, the sculpture that has probably been reproduced more often than any other in the history of the world, and two of my own favorite sculptures, anytime, anywhere. When I give a tour or a lecture on sculpture, I have two goals. First, I want you to understand and appreciate, even if you don't particularly like the sculptures that we look at. Second, I want you to learn how to look at and appreciate any other sculptures that you see. In other words, I want you to be able to look for yourself, not just nod at what I say I see. Aside from that, there are two recurring themes in this particular tour. One is allegorical figures, what they are, how to interpret them, and the other is the importance of setting. The first stop on the tour is Surrogates Court, the sculptures at ground level on Chambers Street. We are looking at this sculpture and this one, which is sort of hiding behind the tree. My usual approach to a sculpture is to look at the details and then identify the subject and then work my way through to the theme of the work, what the artist is saying is important and worth noticing. Only after that do I usually consider the reasons for my emotional reaction and try to judge the work in aesthetic or historical or philosophical terms. I recently published a book, Getting More Enjoyment from Sculpture That You Love, that discusses my method in detail. But taking that approach with these two sculptures caused me many frustrating hours. Eventually I decided that I couldn't identify the figures because they're not meant to be standalone sculptures. They are allegorical figures attached to a building, and to understand their meaning, one has to understand their context. So let me start with a few words on allegorical figures and on this building in particular. An allegorical figure is a human figure that represents not a real or fictional person, but an abstract idea or concept. Lawyers will be familiar with justice, usually shown with a blindfold and holding the scales of justice and a sword. Other common examples are liberty, music, fame, and victory. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, allegorical figures featured prominently on many government buildings. The municipal building just across Center Street from Surrogates Court is a nearby example. Allegorical figures on government buildings tell us these ideas or these virtues are important for citizens of this city or state or nation. Many allegorical figures are interesting and well executed, but they're best appreciated if you approach them as an intellectual puzzle rather than as standalone works meant to evoke an immediate personal reaction. You figure out what they represent first, and the emotional reaction, if any, comes from that. The Surrogates Court building, completed in 1907, has more sculptures on it than any other structure in New York City. The fifth-floor cornice has 8 life-size portrait sculptures. That's these, some of them. On the 4 facades are about 30 allegorical figures, including chemistry, electricity, summer, winter, history, navigation, and philosophy. There's a blog post on my website that lists all of those. We're going to look only at these two groups at ground level. Both are by Philip Martini. And before we go any further, I'd like you to think about whether you like these, and just make a note of your gut reaction. The Surrogates Court was originally the Hall of Records, in other words, the New York City Archives building. It was where the city's historical documents were stored. Each of the two groups on the Chambers Street side at street level represents New York at a different historical period. So let's look at this one. On one side of that group is an Indian with a feathered headdress, a loincloth, and a leather shield. I don't know if these details are ethnographically correct for any of the Native Americans who once inhabited Manhattan, but they certainly make the figure identifiable as an Indian. This figure suggests that this whole group is probably related to New York's early history. On the other side of the group is a man with a tall hat with a buckle and a feather, baggy trousers, and square-toed shoes. Who do we know in American history that dressed like that? Either the 17th century English, for example the Puritans in Massachusetts, or the 17th century Dutch. The Dutch founded New Amsterdam in Lower Manhattan in 1624. The colony's arms are at the upper right. It was 3 X's down the center and a beaver on top. It was adapted from the arms of Amsterdam. But there is a shield behind our figure, right here, and it doesn't look like the 3 X's from the New Amsterdam arms. It looks like part of the windmill that appeared on the colonial arms of New York. So this figure is probably English. The English took over New Amsterdam and renamed it New York in 1664. The central figure of this group, a woman, shows what Martini, the sculptor, thought New York was like under English rule. She wears a low, round crown, a reminder that the colony was ruled by a monarch. That's this. Above and behind her, here, is a palm branch. That's a standard symbol for victory. Given the context, it's probably the English victory over the Indians and the Dutch. The woman has books in one hand and a rolled paper in the other. That implies, at the very least, that the people of the time were educated, not just illiterate. The cover of one of the books has the title Lex, which means law. Here you can see it. And this document she has in her hand has a sort of seal on, which makes it probably a legal document. So the message of this particular allegorical group is that after the English took over New Amsterdam in 1664, the colony of New York was under the rule of a monarch, but also under the rule of law. Law and literacy suggest a fairly high level of civilization. All right, let's look at the second group. What is the profession of the figure on the left of this group? He's a soldier. He wears a uniform, he wears a helmet, he holds a rifle standing here. He's standing in front of a shield on which you can read part of the motto On y soit qui mal y pense, which is the motto of England. Never mind that it's French. So this soldier represents the might of the British Empire. The woman on the other side of the group wears a long dress in the style of the 18th century. She looks as if she's outdoors. She's wearing a hat, she's carrying a bunch of flowers, and I'm pretty sure that this is some sort of tool or implement for working outdoors in her hand. The laurel leaves behind her head symbolize victory. The shield that peeks out behind her skirt, you can see it here, bears the stars and stripes. So she represents Americans who, although they were mostly farmers, emerged from the Revolutionary War triumphant against the might of the British Empire. The woman at the center of this group represents Martini's idea of what was important about New York City at the time of the Revolutionary War and just after. She wears a helmet, so she is willing to fight. In one hand, here, is a torch. A torch often represents enlightenment, as it does in the Statue of Liberty. In her other hand, this is interesting, supports a globe. And that's odd, because at the time of the Revolutionary War, the United States was certainly not a global superpower. But this sculpture was completed in 1907, less than a decade after the Spanish-American War, which we fought in Cuba and the Philippines. So the globe in this figure's hand foreshadows America's international power by the early 20th century. Between the woman's hand and the globe, there is nestled an owl. The owl, combined with that helmet she's wearing and the classical drapery, make this woman identifiable not only as New York, but as Athena, goddess of wisdom, war, and justice among the Greeks. By making the central allegorical figure of New York share Athena's attributes, Martini associates New York and her citizens with all those qualities. So these two groups portray New York as it was before and after the Revolutionary War, in colonial times with a literate population and rule of law, and after independence with justice, wisdom, and the ability to defend herself. I asked at the beginning of the tour if you liked these at first glance. How do you feel about them now? Do you like them more or less? In allegorical figures, as with most works of visual art, knowledge makes a difference. Allegorical figures can be superb technically, but an emotional reaction usually comes only after you understand their content and context. Next week's blog post will be on the highly controversial allegorical sculpture that used to stand in front of City Hall. DianeDuranteWriter.com has hundreds of posts on sculpture, painting, Central Park, and my many other obsessions. To join the free Sunday recommendations list, visit the URL online or just email me. And you can say, "Well done, Diane," or support my work on a recurring basis and receive rewards by means of the tip jar on dianedurantiewriter.com. Thank you as always for listening.